Hello and welcome to Elemental Hardware Enrichment. My name is Aiden and today we're going to be building a lockbox. Before we get started with building, let's go ahead and introduce the supplies that we're going to need for this project. For this project, we're going to need a hardware tray, a roll of tape, some wood glue, safety glasses, let's go ahead and put those on now, a damp rag for glue cleanup, a pencil, a sanding block, and our sandpaper. Now that we've introduced all the supplies, the next step will be to introduce our tools that we'll need for this project. Let's go ahead and introduce our tools. For this project, we're going to need an adjustable wrench, a hammer, a number 2 Phillips head screwdriver, a measuring tape, a PH1 bit, and a screwdriver handle. Now that we've introduced all of our tools, the next step will be to open up our box and talk about the materials we're going to find inside. Now that we've introduced our supplies and tools, the next step will be to open up our box and talk about the materials we're going to find inside. So to open up the box, I'm going to be using the back of my hammer, and I'm going to slide the claw of the hammer down the tape where the 2 box flaps meet to split it open. Once I've got the tape split open, I can grab the corners of the box and pull them up to open it up. The first thing I'm going to be taking out of my box is my packing paper, and I want to make sure to open that up and check to see if there are any loose parts caught up in there before I get it out of my way. Now let's go over the wood parts that we have inside. The first piece I'm going to be taking out is this piece right here, and this is going to be the bottom of my lockbox. You'll notice that one side has pre-drilled holes at each corner, and the other side has this rabbet running all the way around the edge. This is our bottom. Next, we have this piece, which is going to be the lid for our lockbox, and you'll notice a through hole here that runs all the way through it. This is going to be the lid. Next, we have this piece here, and this is going to be the front wall for our lockbox. You'll notice that it has these mitered edges on each side and a dado running through on that mitered side. Next, we have 3 pieces here that are identical, and these are going to be the sidewalls for our lockbox. Now that we've introduced all of our wood parts, the next step will be to introduce our hardware. All right, we're ready to introduce our hardware. So I'm going to go ahead and take the hardware bag out of the box and get it out of my way. And now let's talk about the different hardware we're going to have inside this bag. The first thing I'm going to take out is going to be my green dot bag, and inside this bag I have my hinges and my hinge screws. Let's go ahead and put that in our hardware tray. Next we have our red dot bag, which is going to contain our 1-inch finish nails. The last bag we have in here is our blue dot bag, which is going to have our keyed lock set. Let's go ahead and take the different parts out of there now. First thing I'm going to have is my set of keys. Next, I have my lock arm. I have my hex nut. And the final thing I have in here is going to be the lock body. Now that we've introduced all of our hardware and materials, the next step will be to sand all of our wood parts so we can get prepped for building. All right, we're ready to begin sanding. So to do that, we're going to need our sandpaper and our sanding block. And we're going to go ahead and open up the sandpaper and make sure that the smooth side is facing up. Then I'm going to place my sanding block right across it and fold the edges over it to make a little sandpaper burrito. Once I've done that, I can begin sanding my wood parts. I want to pay special attention to the cut edges. These are going to be in the end grain of my piece, which you can discern by these layers that you see in them. Let's go ahead and start sanding. Once you've sanded all the end grain edges of your pieces, you're going to want to also sand out the rabbet on your bottom. The last thing we're going to want to do is remove the sandpaper from our sanding block to sand out any of those hard to reach areas. So the first thing I'm going to want to sand out is going to be the through hole on my lid. So I'm going to roll my sandpaper up so that it fits through the hole. I'm going to place it through the hole on the lid, and let's go ahead and sand it out until it's smooth. Once you've sanded out the hole on the lid, we also want to quickly sand out the dado on our front wall. So what I'm going to do is unroll my sandpaper and just use the thin edge of the sandpaper to give that dado a once over. Now that I've sanded all my pieces, the next step is going to be to use my rag to wipe away all the dust from my pieces. Once you've wiped up your pieces, don't forget to wipe up your workstation. Alright, now that we've got all of our pieces sanded and cleaned up, we're ready to start building our box. The first step is going to be to set our wall pieces together to build the frame for our lockbox. We're ready to begin assembling the frame for our lockbox. So we're going to need a little bit of space for this, so let's go ahead and move some of our pieces out of the way to make sure we have plenty of room. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set all of our wall pieces onto our workstation so that the mitered edge faces up. Remember, that's the edge that has these slanted edges on both sides. We're then going to line up each of our pieces. And once we have them all lined up, we're going to flip them over. Now that we've got all our pieces flipped over, we're going to use a straight edge and some tape to secure them together. So I'm going to be using my sanding block as a straight edge, and I'm going to line it up between two pieces to make sure they're perfectly straight and secure. Once I've got them lined up with my straight edge, I'm going to go ahead and rip off 3 pieces of tape. Once again, I want to double check that my pieces are lined up, and then I'm going to set my first piece of tape right in the center between the 2 pieces. I'm going to begin by securing it to one side. I'm going to pull it tight and secure it down onto the other side. Once I've done that, I can set the remaining 2 pieces, one above that first piece, and one just below it. Now that I've secured these pieces, I'm going to slide my sanding block over to act as a straight edge for my next 2 pieces. Just like before, once they're lined up, I'm going to pull 3 more pieces of tape. And I'm going to go ahead and tape them off just like I did before. Starting in the center, attaching it to one piece and pulling tight. Another piece just above that. And one piece below. Now I can go ahead and repeat the step to attach the last 2 pieces. Once I've got all my pieces secured together, I'm going to rip off 3 more pieces of tape to save them for a step later on. Alright, I've got my tape ready to go, so now I'm going to go ahead and flip my pieces over, and I'm going to begin laying glue onto the mitered edges of each piece. So let's go ahead and open up our glue bottle. I'm going to take the red cap and place it in my tray, and I'm going to be setting glue onto each of these mitered edges. Now this box frame is going to be held together with glue, so we want to make sure to use enough glue to cover the whole mitered edge. Once you've got the glue on there, go ahead and begin spreading it out evenly using a finger. Once you've spread all the glue out, go ahead and wipe your finger clean using your rag, and then you can begin to wipe up any excess glue that may be spilling out onto your work surface. Once you've got all the glue cleaned up, go ahead and begin folding your pieces together to form your frame. Now, as I'm folding them together, I'm squeezing them to squeeze glue into any gaps that might exist between the pieces. Once I get to this last corner, you're going to notice that it's untaped. So this is where the 3 strips of tape that we ripped earlier are going to come in handy. We're going to go ahead and line these corners up and hold them together, and then wipe out any glue that might be spilling out. Once we've done that, we can set one piece of tape right here in the center, hold everything together, pull tight, and tape off this corner. Once we've got the corner taped, let's go ahead and secure 2 more strips of tape. Now that we've got our frame all taped up, the next step will just be to wipe up any excess glue. So I'm going to start with my work surface, check the outside edges. And what's really important is you want to check the inside of your box frame at these corners. That's where most of the glue is going to be. So I'm going to take the tip of my rag and start to wipe up those corners. Now you may notice that there's some glue that you're having trouble getting out. So what you can do is take your Phillips head screwdriver, place the tip of the screwdriver around the rag, or place the rag around the tip, and use that to wipe up any glue that's in those hard to reach corners. Once you've done that, let's do one last check to make sure we got all the glue. And just like that, our box frame is assembled and we're ready to move on to the next step, which is going to be to attach the bottom. All right, we're ready to attach the bottom of our lockbox. So let's go ahead and move the frame off to the side for now, and we're going to locate our bottom. Now remember I mentioned before that the bottom has this rabbet running along one edge, and that's going to help it fit securely onto the frame of our lockbox. So we want to start by placing this piece down onto our work surface so that the rabbet faces down. We're then going to go ahead and open up our red dot bag containing our finish nails. Let's dump those into our tray, and we're going to be placing one finish nail into each of the up-facing holes on the bottom. Now that we've got those nails set, let's go ahead and move this off to the side just for a second, and let's take a look at our frame. Now, if you remember, the front wall of our frame has a dado here on the inside edge, and it's very important that that dado is at the top of our box, which means that we want it facing down when we attach the bottom. So I'm going to double check where my dado is and place the frame onto my work surface so that the edge with the dado is down towards the bottom. Double check that that's correct. That's very important, or else your lockbox won't function. Once you've ensured that that's correct, you can begin laying glue onto the up-facing edge. Once you've got the glue on there, go ahead and spread it evenly using a finger. Now that we've got our glue spread, let's wipe our finger clean, and then we can lay the bottom over the top of that glued edge so that the rabbet fits around our frame. Once we've got it on there, we can begin lining it up so that it's flush with our frame. One trick to do this is to use your sanding block, and that can help you flush up every side. We're going to keep checking around with our fingers, running it up and down the edge between the frame and the bottom to make sure that those edges are flush. Once we're happy with the fit, we can begin hammering in our nails. So I'm going to need my hammer for this step. I'm going to use my non-dominant hand to hold the bottom in place, and I'm going to tack in my first nail. That means I'm going to hit it about halfway down. Once I've got that nail tacked in, I still have the option to take it out in case I notice that anything's wrong with my alignment. It's So let's go ahead and double check that we're flush. And once we've confirmed that, we can go ahead and finish off that first nail. Once that first nail's in, let's go ahead and do our next nail. But let's do one last check to make sure we're flush before we do. Once we have that second nail in there, we're going to do another check to make sure we're flush before we hammer our next nail. But you'll notice that I'm using my right hand as my dominant hand. So I want to make sure that the nails I'm hammering are oriented towards my dominant hand. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate my project so that these nails are closer to my hammering hand. And now I can go ahead and hammer in my next nail. Once you have 3 nails in there, that bottom is not going to move at all, so you can go ahead and hammer off the remaining nails. Now that we have all of our nails hammered in, we want to double check that these nails are flush. This lockbox has nails on the bottom facing edge, which means that if any of these nails are sticking out, they may scratch up a surface when we lay it on top of that surface. So we want to make double sure that all of our nails are flush and that none of them are sticking out. We can do that by running our finger over each nail. If you do notice that any of the nails are sticking up, just give them a couple more taps with the hammer. Once you've tapped them down, double check that they're flush. All of our nails are feeling flush, so the last step is just going to be to wipe up any excess glue. Once you've wiped up the outside, be sure to check inside your box for any glue that might be spilling out in there. All right, we've successfully attached the bottom and our box is really coming together. The next step is going to be to begin to attach the hinges to our box and set the lid. The next step is going to be to attach the hinges to our box so that we can begin to attach our lid. So what we want to do is double check that we have our dado here on our front wall facing down, and we're going to go ahead and place our box so that the back wall is facing up. Now we're going to need to make some marks on the back wall here to measure out where our hinges should go. And the tape's currently in the way, so I'm actually going to move some of this tape out of the way by peeling it up and just kind of pulling it off to the side. Now I want to try not to remove all the tape because it's still holding my sides together. So I'm just going to kind of tear it so that it's still holding the edge here, but I have a nice clean edge here on the top. And I'm going to do that on both sides. Now that we've cleaned up the top a little bit, or the back wall I should say, we can go ahead and use our measuring tape to begin measuring out some guidelines for our hinges. First thing I'm going to do is lay my measuring tape over the back wall, just like this, and lock it in place. I'm then going to use my pencil to measure 1 inch from the short side edge here. So I've got the edge of the measuring tape lined up with the short side edge, and I'm going to go ahead and make a mark right at 1 inch using my pencil. Once I've done that, I'm going to make the same mark at 1 inch on the opposite edge. Once I have my 1 inch marks here on my back wall, I'm going to go ahead and measure from the bottom edge of the box. This time I'm going to be measuring 1 5/8 of an inch from the bottom. So I'm going to count up to 1 inch, and then I'm going to measure out 5/8 above that. And make a mark with my pencil. Once I've done that on one side, I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same thing on the opposite end. Now that I've got my measurements on there, I want to make sure that those measurements are going to line up. So I'm going to be using my sanding block as a straight edge to connect my lines. I'm going to draw one line going up and down through my 1 5/8 inch mark. And then I'm going to draw another line going side to side through my 1 inch mark. And just like that, I've created a right angle. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. line it up with my straight edge, run the pencil through it, and do the same thing right here. Now you can see I have 2 right angles on either side of my box. So the next thing I'm going to go ahead and do is open up my green dot bag and remove my hinges and my hinge screws. So I'm just going to dump those out into the tray. And I'm going to go ahead and open up one of the hinges to show you what it looks like. You'll notice if you take a look at the hinges, one side has a little hump sticking up. So you want to make sure that when you're working with the hinge, that side with the hump sticks up. If I have it this way, there's no hump. So I'm going to turn it over and make sure the hump is sticking up. I'm then going to line up this bottom side of the hinge with the edge of the right angle that's closest to the top of my box. So this is the top edge of my box, and I'm lining up that outside corner of the bottom of the hinge right here along the edge, just like that. Once I've done that, I'm going to make sure that it's straight along my guideline. I'm going to hold it in place with my offhand, and I'm going to use my dominant hand to make some marks in the circles of the hinge. So just like this, I'm just going to outline these circles using my pencil. When I take that away, I should have 2 clear circles right here next to that right angle. And I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side. Line up the bottom edge of my hinge right there so that the bottom edge of the hinge is exactly 1 inch from the edge of my box. Double check that I'm lined up straight and go ahead and make my marks. Now when I pull the hinge away, I have some clear guidelines where the holes for my hinge are going to go on both sides. Once I have those guidelines in there, I can begin to create my own pilot holes using my hinge screws. So for this, I'm going to need a couple of tools. I'm going to need my screwdriver handle. I'm going to need my PH1 bit, which I'm going to place right here inside the screwdriver handle. And I'm also going to need my hammer. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of my hinge screws and I'm going to set it onto that PH1 bit. I'm then going to carefully line up the tip of the screw over one of those marks that I made with my pencil. So over those little circles, just like that. Once I have that lined up, I'm going to hold it steady with my non-dominant hand, and I'm going to use my hammer to lightly tap the screw to set it into the hole. Once I've set the screw, I can now begin screwing it down using the screwdriver, and I'm going to screw it down about 3/4 of the way. Once I've done that, I can go ahead and remove the screw, and I'm going to do the same thing on the mark right next to it. So I'm going to line the screw up right over it, hold it in place with my non-dominant hand, give it a light tap to set the screw, and then let's go ahead and screw it in about 3/4 of the way. Now I can go ahead and remove the screw, and you can see I have 2 pilot holes that I've created here in the back wall for my hinges. Now that I've done that on one side, I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same thing on the opposite end. I'm going to hold the screwdriver with the screw attached right over the mark, hold it in place, lightly tap it, and screw it down. Once I've got it about 3/4 of the way, I'm going to go ahead and remove the screw and then do the same thing right next to it. Now when I remove the screw, I now have 4 perfectly placed pilot holes to attach the hinges to the back wall here. So the next step is actually to attach our hinges. Let's go ahead and set this back down. And we're going to pick up one of our hinges. Again, double check that the hump is facing up. And we're going to line the hinge holes right up over those pilot holes. Make sure that your hinge is set on straight. Hold it in place. And go ahead and set a screw into each of those holes using your fingers. Now, if your hinge moves around a little bit during this, that's okay. We can start screwing these down, and we can actually adjust our hinge to the right position before we tighten them all the way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to screw these down about 3/4 of the way. Just enough so that they're close to tight, but I can still move my hinge around. Now that I've got them almost there, I'm going to go ahead and double check for the alignment of my hinge and make sure that it's straight. Now that I've got it straight, I'm going to hold it in place and tighten down these screws. All right, now we have our hinge attached on this side. We're going to go ahead and do the same thing on the other side with our remaining hinge. So remember, hold the hinge so that the hump faces up, line it up over our pilot holes, and go ahead and set your screws. Once you've got it on there, you can just kind of hold it in place lightly, and we're going to screw these screws down about 3/4 of the way. Remember, just enough that we can still move our hinge around. Once we've got it close to tight, go ahead and double check the alignment of your hinge, make sure that it's straight, hold it in place, and tighten those screws off. So now you can see we have our hinges attached on both sides of our back wall. So the next step will be to attach our lid using those hinges. So what we're going to go ahead and do is set this down so that the open edge faces up. And we're going to place our lid right over the top. Now what's really important is the orientation of the lid. You can see that there's this pre-drilled hole here, and that's where our lock body is going to sit. So we need to make sure that this hole is oriented close to our front wall with the dado, so that when we lock the lock, it engages into that dado. So I'm going to go ahead and set this in place, double check that the hole is in front of the front wall or opposite from my hinges. That's another way to think about it. And then I'm going to begin lining up the lid so that it's nice and flush with my box. Take your time with this. It's really important that you get this flush so that it all looks nice once you set your hinges into the lid. Once you've got it to a place that you're happy with, you're going to go ahead and rip off some tape. You're going to hold the lid in place and tape it off on one corner. Now that I've got one corner taped off, I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing on the opposite side. I don't have to hold it in place anymore because this should hold it. But before I set this tape, I do want to double check that I'm still flush. And it's feeling good, so let's go ahead and tape off this other corner. Now this should hold our lid in place, but just to be safe, we're going to add a couple of pieces of tape to the front, just because we really don't want our lid to move while we're attaching the hinges. All right, now that we've got this secured, we're going to go ahead and pick this up and set it so that the back wall is facing up, our hinges are facing up, and we're going to go ahead and move our hinges up so that they rest against our lid. Now we're going to go ahead and begin to set our screws just like we did on the back wall. So I'm going to grab another hinge screw and my screwdriver handle with the PH1 bit, set the screw in there, and I'm not making marks this time. I'm just using the hinges as my guidelines. So I'm going to set the screw right there into the hinge hole. I'm going to set it in there, hold it in place with my offhand, and tap it to set the screw. Once I've set it, I can go ahead and begin screwing it down, but I'm not going to screw it down all the way. I'm going to screw it down about 3/4 of the way so I can still adjust the hinge if I need to. Once I've got it about 3/4 of the way down, I can remove the screwdriver and go ahead and set my next screw. Just like we did before, place it in there, line it up, and tap it in. Then we can go ahead and screw it down, and again, just about 3/4 of the way. Once we've got it about 3/4 of the way in, we can double check that our hinge is aligned properly and then hold it in place while we screw these down the rest of the way. Now that we've got our screw set, we can go ahead and do the same thing on the opposite end. So I'm going to pick up another screw, set it onto my screwdriver, place it over the hole, set it, and screw it down about 3/4. Now we can set our final screw. And screw it down 3/4 of the way as well. Once we've got that in there, let's go ahead and make sure our hinge is lined up properly, hold it in place, and tighten down those screws. All right, and just like that, we have our lid secured to our box. So let's go ahead and remove the tape and test out the lid. All right, let's go ahead and open it up and make sure it's going to work. And as you can see, the lid functions perfectly. So now that we have our lid attached with our hinges, the next step is going to be to set our lock body into the hole on the lid to finish off our lockbox. Now it's time to attach the lock body to the lid of our lockbox. So let's go ahead and pick up the lock body, and you'll notice that one side has the keyhole and the other side has this screw set in it. So we're going to use our number 2 Phillips head screwdriver to remove the screw. Once you've loosened it up, you can use your fingers to remove it and place it into your hardware tray. We're then going to place the lock body through the hole in the top of our lid so that the keyhole faces up. From there, we're going to hold the lock body in place while we open up the lid, and we're going to attach the nut. Now you'll notice that the nut has a smooth side and a side with these little teeth. We want to make sure that the teeth are facing down towards the bottom of the lid because they're going to help secure the lock body in place. And we're going to go ahead and just set this on pretty loosely because we want to make sure that we have our lock body oriented correctly. What's important is that we want to ensure that the lock body has the keyhole parallel with the long side edge of our lid. Once we have it parallel, we can then go ahead and screw that nut on tight. Once we have it as tight as we can with our fingers, we're going to use our adjustable wrench to finish it off. So go ahead and adjust your wrench so that it's the right size for the nut, and begin to tighten that nut down as much as you can. Now you may notice as you're tightening the nut that the lock body begins to rotate. And that's okay. What you want to do is make sure as you rotate it that you turn it all the way around so that you end up with the keyhole parallel with this long side edge. So I'm just going to adjust that slightly. And I'm just checking to make sure that it's going to end up parallel with the long side edge of my lid. And that should be right there. So now I know that when I attach the lock arm, it's going to engage fully into the dado in the front. So we have our lock body secured to the lid. The next step is going to be to attach the lock arm. So I have my lock arm here, and I'm also going to need that screw from earlier. I'm going to go ahead and open up my lid, and I'm going to set the lock arm onto this little square piece on the top of the lock body. And I'm going to hold it in place and ensure that it's pointing straight forward towards the edge of the lid. That's really important. Make sure that it's straight. Once you have it on there, hold it in place and set the screw with your fingers. Once you have the screw set, you're going to hold this in place with your thumb and use the screwdriver to tighten that screw. All right, and now we can see that this is set. So when we set the key into the hole on our body, we can rotate it from right to left, just like that. So right now it's unlocked, and this will be the locked position. I'm going to set it to the unlocked position, close my lockbox, and then turn the key, and now my box is locked. So we finished constructing our lockbox. The next step is going to be to wait for everything to dry so we can remove the tape and get it decorated. I'm going to give it some time to dry, remove the tape, decorate it, and I'll be right back. All right, I got my lockbox all decorated, and now I'm ready to take it home and begin using it to store money, collectibles, jewelry, whatever I want to put in it. I really hope that you guys enjoyed building this with me on Elemental Hardware Enrichment. My name is Aiden, and I'm looking forward to seeing you on the next one.